They ripped my dress to shreds in front of everyone, laughing as I tried to cover myself with torn silk. I was nothing, a rejected wolf with no pack, no family, no hope. But then he walked through that door. Golden eyes. Designer suit. Power that made the air itself tremble. Without a word, he wrapped me in his coat and said the 4 words that changed everything: "You belong to me now." I thought he was my savior. I had no idea he was my doom. What I'm about to tell you will shatter everything you think you know about love, betrayal, and the monsters that hide in plain sight. This isn't just a werewolf story, this is the confession of the last hybrid princess, the girl whose blood could unite kingdoms or destroy them all. And it starts with the most dangerous lie ever told: "I'm here to protect you." My name is Seraphina, and this is how I discovered that sometimes the greatest predators were the most beautiful masks. Before we dive in, drop a comment with your country and what time it is where you're watching. I want to know if you're staying up late in Tokyo or having morning coffee in London. Now buckle up, because this story will leave you questioning everyone you trust. Chapter 1: The Humiliation. The fabric tore like thunder in the suffocating silence of the abandoned warehouse. Seraphina's emerald dress, the last beautiful thing she owned, hung in shredded ribbons around her trembling body. Marcus, her former mate, stood over her with predatory satisfaction gleaming in his amber eyes. "Look at you now, princess," he sneered, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "No fancy dress can hide what you really are. Worthless. Abandoned. Nothing." The other wolves in his pack circled closer, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Rain hammered against the grimy windows, each drop a witness to her shame as she clutched the torn silk against her chest, trying desperately to cover herself. Her knees scraped against the cold floor as she scrambled backward, heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. This was supposed to be a simple meeting. Marcus had promised to return the belongings she'd left behind when she fled his pack territory 3 months ago. Instead, it was a trap, designed to humiliate her one final time. "Please," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded in the cavernous space. The scent of rust and decay filled her nostrils, mixing with the overwhelming musk of dominant wolves who saw her as prey. She was completely alone, outnumbered 5 to 1, with nowhere to run. The exit felt a million miles away. "Please?" Marcus mocked, crouching down until his face was inches from hers. His breath reeked of whiskey and malice. "You lost the right to beg when you rejected me, when you chose to be a rogue rather than submit to your rightful place." His fingers traced the air near her throat, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "I should have marked you when I had the chance. Should have made sure you could never leave." The other wolves growled their agreement, a symphony of threatening sounds that made her blood turn to ice. She closed her eyes, preparing for whatever fresh hell he had planned. The warehouse door exploded inward with a sound like breaking bones. Through the splintered wood stepped a figure that seemed to absorb all the light in the room, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of an apex predator. His dark hair was slicked back by rain, and when he lifted his head, Seraphina gasped. Golden eyes, but not like Marcus's cruel amber. These were molten gold, ancient and powerful, burning with an inner fire that made her breath catch in her throat. He wore an expensive black coat that billowed behind him like wings, and every wolf in the room, including Marcus, immediately dropped their heads in submission. The newcomer's gaze swept the warehouse before settling on her with laser focus. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat and crossed the space between them in 3 swift strides. The luxurious fabric settled around her shoulders like a warm embrace, instantly blocking out the cold and covering her destroyed dress. His scent enveloped her, pine forests after rain, leather, and something wild and untamed that made her wolf purr for the first time in months. "Mine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. The single word sent shockwaves through the room, and Marcus stumbled backward as if he'd been struck. The stranger's hand found her chin, tilting her face up to meet his burning gaze. "You're safe now, little wolf. No one will touch what belongs to the Alpha King. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are." Now, let's dive into the story. 3 months earlier, Seraphina had been a different person entirely. She'd lived in a cozy cottage on the edge of the Silverwood Pack territory, spending her days tending to injured animals and brewing healing potions with herbs she grew in her garden. The pack members loved her. She was the gentle healer who never turned anyone away, who worked through the night to save a dying pup or mend a warrior's broken bones. Her life had been simple but meaningful, filled with purpose and the quiet satisfaction of helping others. She believed she belonged somewhere, that she had finally found her place in the world after years of wandering from pack to pack as an orphaned wolf. That was before Marcus noticed her. He was the pack's head enforcer, handsome and charming when he wanted to be, with a silver tongue that could convince anyone of anything. At first, his attention had been flattering. Flowers left on her doorstep, compliments that made her cheeks burn, promises of a future together that seemed too good to be true. "You're special, Sarah," he'd whispered during their first kiss beneath the ancient oak tree where generations of wolves had pledged their love. "You're going to be my Luna, and together we'll make this pack stronger than ever." She'd been so lonely, so desperate to belong, that she'd ignored the warning bells in her head and opened her heart to him completely. The first sign of trouble came when he started questioning her work. Why was she spending so much time with other wolves? Why did she care more about helping strangers than taking care of him? The criticism was subtle at first, wrapped in concerns about her safety and gentle suggestions that maybe she should focus more on their relationship. But gradually, the suggestions became demands, and the demands became threats. He began isolating her from her friends, telling her that the other pack members were jealous of their relationship and spreading lies about her. When she protested, he'd pull her close and remind her how much he loved her, how he was only trying to protect her from wolves who didn't understand their bond. The breaking point came on a cold February night when she'd refused to let him mark her during a pack ceremony. She wasn't ready for that level of commitment, and something deep in her wolf's instincts had recoiled from the idea of bearing his claim. Marcus's reaction had been swift and terrifying. His eyes had flashed with rage, and he'd grabbed her wrist so hard she'd heard bones crack. "You don't get to say no to me," he'd snarled, his wolf rising to the surface. "You're mine, whether you want to be or not." That night, she'd seen the monster hiding beneath his handsome facade, and she'd known with crystal clarity that she had to run. By dawn, she'd packed her few possessions and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the only home she'd known. Living as a rogue was harder than she'd imagined. Most packs wouldn't accept a lone wolf without references or a sponsor, especially a female with no fighting skills and a mysterious past. She'd survived by offering her healing services to anyone who needed them, sleeping in abandoned buildings and eating whatever she could forage or afford with the meager coins people paid her. The loneliness was crushing. Wolves weren't meant to live alone, and every day without pack bonds felt like slowly suffocating. But even in her darkest moments, when hunger gnawed at her belly and cold seeped into her bones, she knew she'd made the right choice. Freedom, even painful freedom, was better than the gilded cage Marcus had been building around her. She just hadn't expected him to hunt her down and drag her back into his web of control. Kieran Blackthorne had ruled the supernatural world from the shadows for over 2 centuries, his name whispered in both reverence and terror across every pack territory in North America. He was the alpha of alphas, the one wolves called when their problems were too big for traditional pack justice. Tonight, he'd come to this decrepit warehouse following a tip about illegal fighting rings, expecting to find the usual collection of rogue wolves betting on blood sport. Instead, he'd walked into something that made his ancient wolf snarl with protective fury. The sight of the trembling she-wolf surrounded by predators had triggered every dominant instinct he possessed, and the word "mine" had torn from his throat before his logical mind could stop it. Now, as he watched her clutch his coat around her shaking form, something inside his chest cracked open like ice in spring. She was beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance. There was a light in her green eyes that spoke of kindness and strength, even though both were clearly battered by whatever hell she'd endured. Her scent was intoxicating, a mixture of wild flowers and something uniquely her that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin. He'd had lovers over the years, plenty of them, but none had ever made him feel this immediate, overwhelming need to protect and possess. It was dangerous, this instant connection, but he couldn't bring himself to care about the complications it would bring. Marcus and his pack were backing away now, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of true power. Kieran had never met the enforcer personally, but he recognized the type, a petty tyrant who used his strength to control those weaker than himself. The way the she-wolf flinched when Marcus moved told Kieran everything he needed to know about their history. "You have 10 seconds to leave this city," he said conversationally, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "If I see any of you again, I'll make sure your deaths are creative enough to serve as examples to other wolves who think they can hunt defenseless females." The golden glow in his eyes intensified, and the temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You don't understand," Marcus stammered, his face pale with fear. "She's my mate. She belongs to me. You can't just..." The words died in his throat as Kieran moved faster than human eyes could follow, appearing directly in front of the younger wolf with one hand wrapped around his neck. The Alpha King's claws extended just enough to draw thin lines of blood, and Marcus whimpered like a kicked dog. "She rejected you," Kieran said softly, his voice deadly calm. "Which means any claim you think you have is null and void. Touch her again, and I'll show you what happens to wolves who don't respect rejection." He released Marcus with a contemptuous shove that sent the enforcer sprawling across the concrete floor. As the pack of cowards scrambled for the exit, tripping over themselves in their haste to escape, Kieran turned his attention back to the she-wolf who had somehow managed to slip past every defense he'd built around his heart. She was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror, and he realized she had no idea who he was or what he'd just done by claiming her in front of witnesses. In the supernatural world, such declarations carried weight. He'd essentially just painted a target on both their backs. But as he looked into her beautiful, haunted eyes, Kieran found he didn't regret his impulsive words. For the first time in centuries, he'd acted on instinct rather than calculation, and the rightness of it settled into his bones like coming home after a long, cold journey. Chapter 2, Sanctuary in Shadows. Kieran's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the obsidian tower that dominated the city's skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the glittering lights below. Seraphina stood frozen in the marble entryway, overwhelmed by the luxury that surrounded her. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most wolves made in a lifetime, artwork that belonged in museums, furniture that looked like it had been crafted by master artisans. She felt like a wounded sparrow that had somehow found its way into a golden palace, dirty and broken and completely out of place. Kieran moved through the space with casual familiarity, but she noticed how his eyes never stopped scanning for threats, how his body remained coiled and ready despite the apparent safety of his domain. Something about the way he moved triggered a flash of recognition deep in her mind. She'd seen that exact predatory grace before, though she couldn't remember where. "The guest bedroom is through here," he said, leading her down a hallway lined with abstract paintings that seemed to shift and move in the soft lighting. As they walked, Seraphina's fingers trailed along the silk wallpaper, and she felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu wash over her. The texture beneath her fingertips was familiar, as if she'd touched these very walls countless times before. "You'll find clothes in the wardrobe. My assistant stocks every size. The bathroom is fully equipped, and there's food in the kitchen whenever you're hungry." His voice was gentle now, stripped of the lethal authority he'd wielded in the warehouse, but Seraphina could still sense the predator lurking beneath his civilized exterior. When he opened the bedroom door, she gasped despite herself. The room was larger than her entire cottage had been, decorated in soothing blues and silvers that reminded her of moonlight on water. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the air with the comforting scent of burning oak. But it was more than just the beauty of the room that stole her breath. It was the crushing certainty that she'd stood in this exact doorway before. The placement of the furniture, the way the firelight played across the cream-colored carpet, even the particular shade of blue in the curtains, all of it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Her hand flew to her throat as a wave of emotion crashed over her, so intense and inexplicable that her knees nearly buckled. "This room," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "I've been here before." Kieran went very still beside her, his breathing shallow as he watched her reaction with laser-focused intensity. "What do you remember?" he asked, his voice so carefully controlled that she knew her words had shaken him deeply. "I don't know," she admitted, pressing her palm against her temple as fragments of images flashed through her mind like broken film strips. A woman who looked exactly like her standing at these same windows, watching snow fall on a city that looked different somehow. The same woman curled up in the massive bed, crying as if her heart was breaking. The same woman running through these halls, her white nightgown flowing behind her like ghostly wings as she fled from something terrible. "I see myself, I think. But not me. Someone who looks like me, living in this room, but the city outside is different. Older. And I'm so sad, so terrified." She trailed off as another wave of images hit her, golden eyes filled with desperate love, strong hands reaching for her across an impossible distance, a voice screaming her name as darkness claimed her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her throat since he'd wrapped her in his coat, but now it carried deeper meaning. She expected him to demand something in return, wolves like him always did. They didn't rescue random she-wolves out of kindness. There was always a price, always an ulterior motive. But when he turned to face her, the expression in his golden eyes was softer than she'd expected, tinged with something that looked almost like longing, and beneath that, a grief so profound it made her chest ache in sympathy. "Because you needed help," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And because when I looked at you, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever." The cryptic words sent a shiver down her spine, and she noticed how his hands were trembling slightly, as if he was fighting to maintain his composure. "What did you lose?" she pressed, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her that this conversation was dangerous territory. His scent wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, and she felt her wolf purr with recognition even though she was certain they'd never met before tonight. "A love I can never seem to hold on to," he admitted, his voice rough with barely suppressed emotion. "A woman who keeps slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I try to protect her." His golden eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw centuries of pain and longing that made her soul ache. "You look exactly like her. You move like her. You even smell like her. But that's impossible, because she's been dead for over a century." The words hit her like physical blows, and she stumbled backward until her shoulders hit the doorframe. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as she said it, more images were flooding her mind, herself in different time periods, different clothes, different cities, but always with the same golden-eyed man. Always running from danger. Always dying in his arms or watching him die in hers. "You're scaring me," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself as the visions intensified. She saw herself as a pioneer woman in a log cabin, an elegant lady in Victorian dress, a flapper in the roaring 20s, a woman in 1940s clothing fleeing through war-torn streets. In every vision, she was with Kieran, and in every vision, their love story ended in tragedy. "Get some rest," he said, his hand on the doorknob, but his voice was thick with unshed tears. "We'll talk more tomorrow, when you've had time to process everything that's happened." But instead of backing away, he stepped closer, his hand reaching toward her face before stopping just short of touching her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. When she nodded, his fingertips brushed against her skin with infinite gentleness, and the moment their skin made contact, the floodgates opened. Images crashed through her mind like a tsunami, hundreds of lifetimes, hundreds of different ways they'd met and fallen in love and lost each other. She saw herself dying of plague in his arms in 1854. She saw him taking a bullet meant for her in 1943. She saw them both burning in a fire in 1976. She saw him walking into the ocean in 1823 after her ship sank, choosing to drown rather than live without her. "Remember," he whispered, his thumb tracing her cheekbone as tears streamed down both their faces. "Please, my love, remember." And suddenly, she did. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that this man had loved her through centuries of heartbreak, had searched for her in every lifetime, had never stopped believing they could find a way to break the curse that bound them to this endless cycle of loss. "Kieran," she breathed, his name falling from her lips like a prayer. "My God, what have we been through?" He pulled her against his chest then, and she buried her face in his shirt, breathing in the scent that her soul recognized even when her mind couldn't remember. "Too much," he murmured into her hair. "Far too much. But you're here now, and that's all that matters." She wanted to call him back, to demand answers to the hundreds of questions swirling in her mind, but exhaustion hit her like a physical blow, not just from the night's events, but from the weight of recovering fragments of 2 centuries worth of memories. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning through the nightmare in the warehouse was finally wearing off, leaving her shaky and hollow. But now the exhaustion was tinged with something else, the bone-deep weariness of a soul that had loved and lost the same person dozens of times. After he left, she stood in the center of the beautiful room for a long moment, hardly daring to believe she was safe. The silk nightgown she found in the wardrobe fit perfectly, and when she ran her hands over the fabric, she remembered wearing similar gowns in other lifetimes. When she finally crawled between the Egyptian cotton sheets, she felt like she was sinking into a cloud, but also like she was returning to a bed she'd slept in countless times before. Sleep came easier than expected, but it brought with it a torrent of memories that were no longer dreams but recovered pieces of her fractured past. She saw herself as Clara in 1823, meeting Kieran when he was still a young alpha trying to build his first pack. They'd fallen in love during a harsh winter, but a jealous pack member had poisoned her with silver on their wedding day. She died convulsing in his arms while he screamed her name. In 1854, she'd been Rebecca, a healer during a cholera outbreak, and he'd been a wealthy businessman who'd hired her to treat his workers. They'd had 3 beautiful months together before the plague claimed her, and he'd held her hand as she slipped away. In 1889, she was Margaret, a seamstress who'd caught his eye when he was masquerading as a railroad baron. A rival alpha had burned down the boarding house where she lived, and Kieran had died trying to rescue her from the flames. The pattern was always the same: they found each other, fell desperately in love, and were torn apart by forces beyond their control. Sometimes she died first, sometimes he did, but they never got their happy ending. And in every lifetime, there was always a man with amber eyes who served as the instrument of their destruction. In 1823, he'd been Thomas, the jealous pack member. In 1854, he was Robert, a doctor who'd been obsessed with Rebecca. In 1889, he was Michael, the rival alpha. The faces changed, the names changed, but those cruel amber eyes remained constant. In this lifetime, he was Marcus, and once again, he was the threat that would tear them apart. She saw flashes of the original curse too, a powerful witch named Evangeline Blackwood whose son had been killed by a young alpha king in a territorial dispute. Kieran had been defending his pack from raiders, and the witch's son had been leading the attack, but grief had made Evangeline blind to justice. She'd cursed Kieran to live forever but never know lasting love, doomed to watch his true mate die in every lifetime until he learned the true meaning of loss. But the curse had been twisted by her pain. Instead of just affecting Kieran, it had bound both their souls to this endless cycle of reincarnation and tragedy. She woke before dawn with tears on her cheeks and the strange, impossible certainty that her life had just changed in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. But now she understood why Kieran's touch felt like coming home, why his scent calmed her wolf, why she'd been willing to trust him completely despite knowing him for less than a day. Through the massive windows, the city sparkled like a circuit board beneath the stars, and somewhere in the depths of the building, she could hear the soft sound of classical music drifting up from below, a piece she recognized as one Kieran had played for her in 1943, when he'd been a jazz club owner and she'd been a singer trying to escape an abusive marriage. But with the return of her memories came a crushing weight of knowledge. They'd tried everything to break the curse over the past 2 centuries. They'd consulted other witches, sought out ancient artifacts, even attempted to stay apart in some lifetimes to see if distance could protect them. Nothing worked. The curse adapted, evolved, found new ways to tear them apart. And always, there was a descendant of Evangeline Blackwood making sure they never got their happy ending. Marcus wasn't just her ex-mate, he was the latest in a long line of witches' descendants who'd inherited not just her magical bloodline, but her obsession with making sure Kieran suffered. For the first time in months, Seraphina fell back asleep without checking the locks on her door or listening for the sound of approaching footsteps, but not because she felt safe. She fell asleep because she was finally home, not in this room, but in Kieran's arms, metaphorically speaking. The Alpha King's protection wrapped around her like an invisible shield, and for now, that was enough. But as she drifted off, one thought echoed through her mind with crystal clarity: this time had to be different. This time, they had to find a way to break the cycle. Because she couldn't bear to watch him suffer through losing her again, and she couldn't bear to die knowing he'd have to search for her all over again. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sound of movement in the hallway outside her door, not threatening, but restless. Kieran was pacing, she realized, probably grappling with the same recovered memories that were flooding through her mind. How many times had they shared their first kiss? How many times had he rescued her, only to lose her again? How many times had he stood in that hallway, wanting to go to her but knowing that every moment they spent together brought them closer to their inevitable tragedy? But this time felt different somehow. This time, she was remembering while there was still time to fight. This time, they had a chance to change their fate before Marcus could complete whatever plan would destroy them. And this time, she wasn't going to let Evangeline Blackwood's twisted legacy win. She was going to find a way to break the curse, even if it meant confronting forces that had been orchestrating their destruction for over 2 centuries. The war for their souls was just beginning, but for the first time in any lifetime she could remember, Seraphina felt like they might actually have a chance to win. Chapter 3: Dangerous Revelations. The corporate boardroom on the 40th floor buzzed with tension as thick as the storm clouds gathering outside the wall of windows. Seraphina sat beside Kieran, wearing a tailored black dress he'd somehow acquired overnight, trying to look composed while her world tilted on its axis. She'd thought he was simply a wealthy businessman who'd happened to intervene at the right moment, but the wolves filing into the room treated him with a reverence that bordered on worship. They called him Your Majesty and Alpha King, titles that made her stomach clench with realization. She'd somehow stumbled into the orbit of the most powerful supernatural being in North America, and every instinct screamed that she was in way over her head. The Silverwood Pack is demanding her return, reported a stern-faced woman with silver hair and calculating eyes. Marcus claims she stole Pack property when she fled, and he's threatening to bring the matter before the High Council. Kieran's expression didn't change, but Seraphina felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. His hand, resting casually on the mahogany table, began to emit a faint golden glow that made several of the assembled wolves shift nervously in their seats. Marcus can make all the demands he wants, Kieran said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Seraphina is under my protection now. Anyone who challenges that will find themselves answering to me personally. The casual way he spoke about defying pack law for her sake made Seraphina's head spin. She barely knew this man, had shared exactly one conversation with him, yet he was willing to risk political complications to keep her safe. The gesture should have been romantic, but it terrified her instead. In her experience, when powerful males made grand gestures, they expected payment in return, and she had nothing to offer someone who could buy and sell entire cities. I don't understand, she whispered, leaning close enough to smell his intoxicating scent. Why would you do this for a stranger? His golden eyes found hers, and for a moment, she saw something ancient and hungry swimming in their depths. Because you're not a stranger, he murmured, his voice so low only her enhanced hearing could pick up the words. Not to me. Before she could ask what that meant, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. His face went rigid as he read it, and when he looked up, every person in the room took an involuntary step backward. Marcus just posted a bounty, he announced, his words sharp as breaking glass. $50,000 for anyone who brings Seraphina back to Silverwood territory. Alive. The room erupted in angry voices, pack leaders demanding action, but Seraphina heard none of it. Her ex-mate had just turned her into prey for every desperate rogue and money-hungry wolf on the continent. Kieran stood abruptly, his chair spinning away from the table with enough force to crack the wall behind it. Meeting adjourned, he snapped, and the assembled wolves filed out with supernatural speed, leaving Seraphina alone with the Alpha King and her mounting terror. Through the windows, she could see storm clouds gathering like an omen, and lightning split the sky in jagged forks that matched the electricity crackling in Kieran's eyes. He's not going to stop, she said, her voice barely audible above the rumble of thunder. You don't know Marcus like I do. He's obsessed with control, with winning. He'll never let this go. Kieran turned to face her fully, and the predatory grace in his movements made her breath catch in her throat. Then I'll have to make sure he can't hurt you, he said simply. Even if it means going to war. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city had become a warren of desperate wolves drawn by Marcus's bounty, their eyes gleaming in the darkness as they planned their assault on the obsidian tower. Seraphina watched the security feeds from Kieran's command center, her heart hammering as she counted at least 30 figures moving through the underground passages like a pack of hungry rats. They'd been arriving all day, rogues with nothing to lose, mercenaries who killed for money, even a few pack wolves whose loyalty could be bought with cold hard cash. The sight of so many predators hunting her made her feel sick to her stomach, but what terrified her more was the way Kieran stood motionless beside her, his golden eyes glowing with anticipatory violence. Something about his stillness felt wrong, like a spider waiting at the center of its web for prey to stumble into its trap. This is my fault, she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself as another group of wolves appeared on the northeastern camera feed. But as she spoke, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Kieran's lips curved into the faintest smile, so brief she almost missed it. It wasn't the expression of a man watching his enemies approach, it was the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. I should leave. If I'm gone, they'll have no reason to attack you or your people. The words felt like glass in her throat, but she meant them. She'd brought this danger to his doorstep, had made him a target simply by accepting his protection. Better to face Marcus alone than to watch innocent wolves die because of her cowardice. But when she turned toward the door, Kieran's hand shot out faster than lightning, wrapping around her wrist with gentle but unmovable strength that felt more like a shackle than a protective gesture. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled fury that seemed disproportionate to her suggestion. His grip tightened just enough to be uncomfortable, and for the first time since he'd rescued her, Seraphina felt a flicker of genuine fear. I don't abandon what's mine. The possessive declaration sent shivers down her spine, but not the good kind. There was something dark and hungry in his tone that made her wolf shrink back in alarm. She tried to pull away, but his fingers remained locked around her wrists like iron bands, and when she looked up at his face, she saw something predatory and cold swimming in those golden depths that had seemed so warm and protective just moments before. The possessive declaration sent shivers down her spine, but before she could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the building. On the screens, she watched as the first wave of bounty hunters emerged from the subway grates, moving with coordinated precision toward the tower's base. But something was wrong with the scene unfolding before her. The security team's response was too slow, too disorganized, as if they'd been deliberately positioned to fail. There are too many, she breathed, watching wolves pour out of the underground like ants from a disturbed nest. Your people are going to get hurt because of me. But as she studied the feeds more carefully, she noticed that Kieran's supposedly elite security forces were falling back almost immediately, abandoning defensive positions that should have been easily held. It was as if they were deliberately allowing the attackers to advance. "My people knew the risks when they chose to serve me," he said firmly, but there was something hollow in his voice, as if he were reciting lines from a script. His thumb brushed across her cheek, and she realized she was crying without knowing when the tears had started, but she also noticed how his eyes tracked the movement of her tears with intense focus, as if they were precious beyond measure. On the monitors, the first shots were being fired, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as his security forces engaged the bounty hunters in the streets below. But the more she watched, the more convinced she became that this was all theater, an elaborate performance designed to create chaos and fear. The guilt was crushing, making it hard to breathe, but underneath it, a new emotion was growing, suspicion. "I can't watch people die for me," she sobbed, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her terror and guilt. But as Kieran pulled her against his chest, she felt something that made her blood freeze, a small, hidden device pressed against his ribs, probably a communication device that would allow him to coordinate the very attack he was pretending to defend against. She buried her face in the soft fabric of his shirt, breathing in his pine and leather scent like a drowning woman gasping for air, but her mind was racing now, connecting dots she'd been too grateful and too trusting to see before. His hand stroked her hair with surprising gentleness, but she could feel the leashed violence thrumming through his body like a live wire, not the protective fury of a mate defending his beloved, but the eager anticipation of a hunter about to claim his prize. "The fighting will be over soon," he murmured into her hair, and something in his tone made ice crawl up her spine. When she pulled back to look at his face, his eyes had gone completely gold, no trace of human brown remaining, but now she wondered if there had ever been any humanity in them at all. His canine teeth had elongated into fangs that seemed too sharp, too predatory for any wolf she'd ever seen, and she could see claws beginning to extend from his fingertips, claws that looked more like talons than the normal claws of her kind. "You're going to shift," she realized, her voice barely a whisper, but the word that came out of her mouth felt wrong somehow. "You're going to kill them all." He smiled then, and it was beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman, but not inhuman in the way of wolves. This was something else entirely, something that made every instinct she possessed scream in terror. "Every last one," he confirmed, and then he was moving toward the door with fluid, predatory grace that made her wolf whimper in recognition of something far worse than a superior predator. As he reached for the door handle, Seraphina's gaze fell on something that made her world tilt sideways, a small vial on his desk, filled with a dark red liquid that she recognized with sick certainty as her own blood. Beside it were other containers, one filled with what looked like tears, another with strands of hair. Her hair. Her tears. Her blood. All collected without her knowledge, all preserved with the careful attention of someone conducting a very specific ritual. The hunt was about to begin, but suddenly she wasn't sure who the real prey was supposed to be. "Kieran," she called out, her voice trembling as the pieces of a horrifying puzzle began falling into place. "What are those vials for?" He stopped with his hand on the door, and when he turned back to face her, the mask of protective concern had slipped completely away. What looked back at her was ancient and hungry and utterly without mercy. "Insurance," he said simply, his voice carrying a note of dark amusement. "Your bloodline is very special, Seraphina. Very rare. Very useful for certain purposes." The way he said her name made her skin crawl, not with desire, but with the sick realization that she'd been played from the very beginning. The truth hit her like a physical blow, and she stumbled backward until her shoulders hit the wall of monitors. "You orchestrated this," she whispered, her voice thick with betrayal and dawning horror. "The bounty, the attack, maybe even Marcus's obsession with me, it was all you, wasn't it?" Kieran's smile widened, revealing teeth that were definitely not those of any wolf she'd ever encountered. They were too sharp, too numerous, designed for tearing rather than the clean killing bite of her kind. "Very good," he purred, his voice taking on harmonics that seemed to vibrate in her bones. I was beginning to wonder if you'd figure it out before the ritual was complete. What ritual? She demanded, though part of her was afraid to know the answer. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the gentle protector who'd wrapped her in his coat with the monster standing before her now. What do you need my blood for? Kieran began to pace the room like a caged animal, but his movements were too fluid, too hypnotic, like a snake preparing to strike. Your bloodline carries the essence of the original lunar blessing, he explained, his tone almost conversational despite the horrific implications of his words. Pure moon magic, undiluted by centuries of mixing with lesser bloodlines. With the right combination of your blood, tears shed in genuine terror, and hair taken while you sleep, I can complete a ritual that will make me truly immortal, not just long-lived like an alpha, but eternal and all-powerful. The casual way he discussed using her body parts for dark magic made her stomach churn, but worse was the realization of how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. The dreams, she gasped, remembering the vivid nightmares that had felt so much like memories. You sent them, didn't you? To make me trust you, to make me think we had some kind of cosmic connection. His laughter was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting and completely devoid of warmth. Oh, my dear little wolf, those dreams were the easiest part. A few drops of nightmare elixir in your water supply, combined with some carefully planted suggestions, and you practically threw yourself into my arms. You wanted so desperately to belong somewhere, to be loved by someone powerful enough to protect you. It was almost too easy. And Marcus? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Was he ever really my mate, or was that part of your manipulation too? Kieran's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering how much truth to reveal. Marcus Blackwood is exactly what he appears to be, a controlling, abusive wolf with delusions of dominance. But he's also desperate for power, and I may have encouraged his obsession with you. A few strategic meetings, some carefully placed suggestions about your supposed value, perhaps a magical compulsion or two to intensify his natural possessiveness. He genuinely believes he loves you, which makes him the perfect unwitting accomplice. The name Blackwood sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Blackwood, she repeated slowly. As in Evangeline Blackwood? The witch who? Her words died in her throat as understanding crashed over her like a tidal wave. You're not Kieran at all, are you? You're not even a wolf. His applause was slow and mocking, each clap echoing in the command center like gunshots. Brilliant deduction. I am indeed something else entirely, something far older and more powerful than any mere Alpha King. The real Kieran Blackthorn died over 2 centuries ago, killed by a demon who needed his identity to gain access to the supernatural power structure. That demon would be me. The revelation shattered what was left of her world, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her legs too weak to support her weight. A demon, she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. You're a demon, and you've been pretending to be the Alpha King for centuries. His form began to shift slightly, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible beneath the handsome human facade, shadows that moved independently of his body, eyes that flickered between gold and burning red, skin that sometimes seemed to ripple like water. Not just any demon, he corrected with obvious pride. I am Malphas, Duke of Hell, commander of 40 legions, and soon to be the immortal ruler of both the supernatural and human worlds. The attacks on your building, she said, her voice hollow with shock. Your own people getting hurt, none of that matters to you, does it? Malphas shrugged, the gesture obscenely casual given the horror of what he was revealing. Acceptable losses in service of a greater goal. Besides, most of my so-called security team are lesser demons in disguise. The few actual wolves I employ are expendable. Their deaths will only add to the chaos and make your eventual disappearance seem like a tragic casualty of war rather than a carefully orchestrated kidnapping. The monitors around them showed the battle raging in the streets below, but now Seraphina could see it for what it really was, not a rescue attempt gone wrong, but a carefully choreographed dance of violence designed to provide cover for her abduction. Marcus, she whispered, a terrible thought occurring to her. If he's really a Blackwood, if he's descended from the witch who cursed the real Kieran, then maybe he wasn't trying to control me. Maybe he was trying to warn me, to save me from you. Malphas's expression darkened, the temperature in the room dropping several degrees as his true nature leaked through his human disguise. Marcus Blackwood may carry the blood of a powerful witch, but he's too weak and too stupid to be a real threat, the demon snarled, his voice taking on inhuman harmonics that made her bones ache. His family has been hunting demons for generations, but he's nothing like his ancestors. Still, I'll admit his interference has been inconvenient. It's why I had to accelerate my timeline, why I couldn't take more time to properly groom you for the ritual. Your terror and despair need to be genuine for the magic to work, and keeping you ignorant of your true situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The ritual, she said, forcing herself to focus on the immediate threat despite the overwhelming horror of her situation. When is it supposed to happen? Malphas glanced at an ornate clock on the wall, and his smile was pure malice. In approximately 1 hour, when the moon reaches its zenith. The lunar alignment will amplify your bloodline's natural magic, making the ritual exponentially more powerful. By dawn, I'll be truly immortal, and this world will have a new master. He moved toward a hidden panel in the wall, revealing an array of ritual implements that made her blood run cold. Silver knives inscribed with demonic symbols, black candles that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it, and a stone altar stained with what could only be old blood. You're insane if you think you can get away with this, she said, trying to inject some defiance into her voice despite the terror that was threatening to paralyze her completely. The real supernatural leaders will figure out what you are eventually. Other wolves, vampires, witches, someone will realize you're not who you pretend to be. Malphas laughed again, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space. My dear, naive little wolf, I've been successfully impersonating Kieran Blackthorn for over 200 years. I've made alliances, signed treaties, eliminated threats to my rule, all while slowly corrupting the supernatural world from within. By the time anyone realizes the truth, I'll be too powerful to stop. The scope of his deception was staggering, and Seraphina felt a wave of despair wash over her as she realized how thoroughly outmatched she was. But then she remembered something that gave her a flicker of hope, the real reason Marcus had been so desperate to find her, so insistent on getting her away from Kieran's influence. Marcus knows, she said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. That's why he's been hunting me, why he seems so desperate. He knows what you are, and he's been trying to save me from you. Malphas's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were reconsidering his earlier dismissal of her ex-mate as a threat. Impossible, he said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. The Blackwood line's power died out generations ago. Marcus is nothing but a petty tyrant with delusions of grandeur. But even as he spoke, Seraphina could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Besides, he continued, his voice gaining strength again, even if he did somehow suspect the truth, he's trapped in the tunnels below with the rest of the bounty hunters. My demons will make sure he never reaches this floor alive. As if summoned by his words, a new alarm began blaring, but this one was different, more urgent, coming from the building's upper levels rather than the street below. What's that? Seraphina asked, hope blooming in her chest as she watched Malphas's confident expression falter. He moved to a different set of monitors, these ones showing the building's internal security, and his face went rigid with fury. On the screens, she could see figures moving through the upper floors of the tower with supernatural speed, not demons or bounty hunters, but wolves, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. And at their head, his face grim with determination and power radiating from him like heat from a forge, was Marcus Blackwood. But this wasn't the Marcus she remembered, this was someone who had finally embraced his true heritage, his eyes blazing with silver light that spoke of ancient magic and righteous fury. The Blackwood line isn't as dead as you thought, Seraphina whispered, and for the first time since entering the command center, she smiled. The hunt was indeed about to begin, but the predator and prey had just switched roles. Malphas, Duke of Hell, was about to discover that some bloodlines carried more than just magical power. They carried the memories and determination of every ancestor who had died fighting demons exactly like him. The real battle for her soul was just beginning, and this time, she wouldn't be facing it alone. Chapter 4, The Alpha's Fury. The elevator descended into the building's sublevels with mechanical precision, but Seraphina could feel Kieran's control slipping away with each passing floor. His human facade was cracking like ice under pressure, revealing glimpses of the ancient predator that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. When the doors opened onto the private garage, she gasped at the transformation that had overtaken him during the brief ride. His eyes blazed like golden furnaces, his muscular frame had expanded to accommodate the wolf pressing against his skin, and the air around him shimmered with barely contained power. He moved toward the garage's reinforced exit with lethal purpose, but when his hand touched the door handle, Seraphina's voice stopped him cold. "Don't leave me here alone," she whispered, hating how small and frightened she sounded but unable to hide her terror. The idea of sitting in the tower while he fought her battles made her feel like a coward, but the thought of him walking into that war zone and never coming back was infinitely worse. He turned to face her, and for a moment, she saw the struggle playing out behind his glowing eyes, the protective instinct warring with his need to keep her safe. "It's too dangerous," he said finally, his voice rougher now, touched with the growl of his wolf. "These aren't ordinary rogues, Sarah. Some of them are trained killers, mercenaries who've been hunting supernatural creatures for decades. I won't risk them getting their hands on you. And I won't risk losing you," she shot back, surprised by her own boldness. The words hung in the air between them like a confession, and she watched something shift in his expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart race. "You barely know me," he said quietly, but there was hope in his voice that he couldn't quite hide. "How can you be willing to risk everything for someone you met yesterday?" The question struck at the heart of her own confusion, but as she looked at him, really looked at him, she realized the truth had been staring her in the face all along. "Because when I look at you, I feel like I'm remembering something I forgot," she admitted. "Like my soul recognizes yours." The confession seemed to shatter the last of his resistance. He crossed the garage in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, his mouth crashing down on hers with desperate hunger. The kiss was fire and storm and coming home all at once, and when they finally broke apart, she could see her own stunned realization reflected in his golden eyes. "I've been waiting for you for centuries," he whispered against her lips, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd given up hope that you existed, that I'd ever find my true mate. But when I saw you in that warehouse, when our eyes met..." He trailed off, but she understood. The instant connection, the overwhelming need to protect and be protected, the sense of rightness that defied all logic, it was the mate bond, rare and precious and completely undeniable. The moment was shattered by the sound of explosions echoing from the streets above, followed by the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire. Marcus's bounty hunters had escalated their assault, and innocent humans were now caught in the crossfire. Kieran's expression hardened into something truly terrifying, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of death. "Stay close to me," he commanded, pulling a set of keys from his pocket and heading toward a sleek black motorcycle that looked like it could outrun anything on 4 wheels. "We're going to end this tonight, once and for all. And after we're done with Marcus and his hired killers, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about destiny." He straddled the bike and held out his hand to her, his golden eyes burning with the promise of violence and the deeper promise of forever. The city streets had become a war zone, with abandoned cars littering the asphalt like metal corpses and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like fog. Seraphina clung to Kieran's back as the motorcycle roared through the chaos, weaving between overturned vehicles and ducking sniper fire from rooftops where Marcus's mercenaries had taken position. But as they rode through the destruction, something strange began happening to her. The scent of spilled blood wasn't making her nauseous as it should have. Instead, it was awakening something deep within her, something that had been dormant her entire life. Her canine teeth were elongating, but not in the familiar way of her wolf preparing to shift. These were different, sharper, longer, designed for puncturing rather than tearing. She could feel the supernatural power radiating from her mate, because that's what he was, she realized with crystal clarity, like heat from a forge, but her own power was responding in ways that defied everything she thought she knew about herself. When they rounded the corner onto Fifth Avenue, her breath caught in her throat, but not just from the sight of the battlefield before them. The overwhelming scent of blood hit her like a physical force, and suddenly her vision sharpened beyond normal werewolf capabilities. She could see individual heartbeats pulsing in the throats of the combatants, could hear whispered conversations from blocks away, could smell the fierce sweat of humans mixed with the musk of desperate wolves. At least 50 armed wolves had surrounded Kieran's security team, who were pinned down behind concrete barriers with nowhere to retreat. Blood stained the pavement, and she could see several bodies that weren't moving, but more than that, she could sense the exact moment when life had left each corpse, as if death itself was calling to something in her blood. "This ends now," Kieran snarled, bringing the bike to a screaming halt in the middle of the battlefield. As he stood slowly, his human disguise finally falling away completely as his wolf surged to the surface, Seraphina felt her own nature responding in unprecedented ways. His bones cracked and reformed, his muscles expanded, and his clothes tore as his body grew to accommodate the massive predator within. But as she watched his transformation with newfound clarity, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She could see the supernatural energy flowing through him like liquid light, could sense the exact nature of his power in ways that no ordinary wolf should be able to. Her vision had shifted to something beyond normal sight, revealing the magical auras that surrounded every supernatural being in the vicinity like colored flames dancing around their bodies. Standing nearly 8 feet tall in his half-shifted form, with claws like razors and fangs that gleamed white in the streetlights, Kieran was every nightmare humans had ever imagined about monsters in the dark. His roar of challenge echoed off the surrounding buildings, and every wolf within a 6-block radius dropped to their bellies in instinctive submission. But Seraphina remained standing, unaffected by the alpha dominance that should have driven her to her knees. Instead, she felt something else rising within her, a power that was older, more primal, and completely different from anything she'd ever experienced. Her reflection in a nearby broken window showed eyes that had shifted from their usual green to a deep crimson that seemed to glow with inner fire, and her skin had taken on an otherworldly pallor that made her look ethereal rather than sickly. The mercenaries who weren't supernatural didn't understand what they were facing until it was too late. Kieran moved through their ranks like death itself, faster than their eyes could track, leaving broken bodies and terror in his wake. But as Seraphina watched the carnage unfold, she found herself focusing not on Kieran's lethal efficiency, but on the blood that painted the asphalt in spreading pools of crimson. The sight should have horrified her, but instead it called to something deep in her DNA, something that whispered of ancient hungers and powers beyond mortal comprehension. She watched in horrified fascination as he tore through a dozen armed men in less than 30 seconds, his movements fluid and precise and utterly without mercy, but she was equally fascinated by the way she could sense each life force winking out of existence like candles being extinguished. When the last of the mercenaries fell, an unnatural silence descended over the street that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. Kieran stood in the center of the carnage, his golden eyes scanning for any remaining threats, his massive chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Blood spattered his transformed features, but none of it was his own, and Seraphina found herself taking an involuntary step toward him, drawn by the scent of iron and violence in ways that terrified her. Slowly, deliberately, he began to shrink back to human form, his bones settling into their normal configuration as his wolf retreated beneath the surface. When the transformation was complete, he looked like nothing more than a well-dressed businessman who happened to be standing in a war zone, but her enhanced senses could still see the predatory energy coiled beneath his human facade like a spring waiting to be released. "It's over," he said simply, extending his hand to help her off the motorcycle, but when his fingers touched hers, both of them froze in shock. Where their skin made contact, sparks of silver light danced between their joined hands, not the warm gold of werewolf magic, but something entirely different. Something that spoke of moon phases and blood rituals and powers that predated the separation of the supernatural species. Around them, his security team was emerging from cover, checking the wounded and securing the area, but several of them stopped to stare at the light show emanating from their joined hands with expressions of awe and terror. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but Seraphina knew they would never reach this block. Kieran had too much influence, too many connections in both the human and supernatural worlds. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, staring at her hand where silver fire danced across her pale skin like living lightning. The power felt familiar yet foreign, as if she were remembering something she'd always known but never acknowledged. "Marcus will hear about this," she said, her voice shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off and the strange new sensations intensified. "He'll know his mercenaries failed, and but even as she spoke, she realized that Marcus was no longer her primary concern. Whatever was awakening within her was far more dangerous than any vengeful ex-mate. Kieran's finger on her lips silenced her worried rambling, but she could see in his golden eyes that he was just as confused and concerned as she was about the supernatural light show they were creating together. "Marcus is already here," he said quietly, his eyes focusing on something behind her with the laser intensity of a predator who'd just spotted movement in his territory. "He's been watching from the shadows, waiting to see if his hired killers could do what he was too cowardly to attempt himself." "Isn't that right, you pathetic excuse for a wolf?" She spun around to see her ex-mate stepping out from behind an overturned car, his amber eyes wild with rage and something that looked dangerously close to madness, but also something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. His gaze was fixed not on her face, but on the silver light that still danced around her hands, and his expression shifted from fury to something that might have been fear. "I knew it," Marcus breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of triumph and terror that made her skin crawl. "I always knew there was something different about you, something that didn't fit with your pack history. But I never imagined." He trailed off, his eyes wide as he took in the supernatural energy radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Do you have any idea what you are, Seraphina? What you've always been?" His words hit her like physical blows, and she stumbled backward into Kieran's protective embrace. But instead of the usual comfort she found in his touch, she felt his body go rigid with shock as new understanding dawned in his golden eyes. "Impossible," Kieran whispered, but his voice carried a note of dawning comprehension that made her blood run cold. "The last hybrid died over 1,000 years ago. The bloodlines were deemed too dangerous to continue, too powerful to be allowed to exist." His hands on her shoulders were trembling now, and she could feel waves of shock and something that might have been fear radiating from him. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, pulling away from both men as panic began to claw at her throat. "What bloodlines? What hybrid?" But even as she asked the questions, pieces of her fractured past were beginning to fall into place. Her unusual healing abilities that worked too well and too fast, her lack of any pack history or family records, the way other wolves had always seemed slightly uncomfortable around her even when she was helping them. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the surrounding buildings like breaking glass. "Show her," he said, his amber eyes burning with malicious satisfaction as he addressed Kieran. "Show her what happens when she tastes blood. Show her what she really is beneath all that carefully constructed innocence." Before either of them could react, he pulled a silver knife from his belt and drew it across his own palm, letting drops of crimson fall to the pavement between them. The scent hit Seraphina like a tsunami, and suddenly the world exploded into sharp focus. Her vision shifted again, this time revealing not just magical auras but the intricate network of blood vessels beneath everyone's skin, the rhythmic pulse of hearts that called to her like music. The hunger that rose within her was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, not the clean, predatory appetite of her wolf, but something deeper and more primal that spoke of ancient cravings and forbidden appetites. Her canine teeth elongated fully, revealing fangs that were definitely not those of any werewolf, and when she looked at her reflection in a nearby puddle of rainwater, the face that stared back at her was pale as moonlight with eyes that burned like rubies. "No," she whispered, backing away from the blood on the ground as if it were poison, but her body betrayed her by taking an involuntary step forward. This isn't possible. I'm a wolf. I've always been a wolf. You're a hybrid, Kieran said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror that made her want to run screaming into the night. Vampire and werewolf. The first of your kind born in over a millennium. His golden eyes were wide with shock as he studied her transformed features, and she could see him mentally cataloging every sign he should have noticed before: her unusual healing speed, her ability to go days without eating, the way she'd never quite fit in with any pack despite her gentle nature. That's why you have no pack history, why you were found abandoned as a baby. Someone hid you, probably to prevent the war that would have erupted if either species had known you existed. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, and she sank to her knees on the blood-stained asphalt as the full implications crashed over her. My parents, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant wail of sirens. They weren't killed in a rogue attack, were they? They gave me up to protect me, to protect everyone. Marcus's cruel laughter confirmed her worst fears, and when she looked up at him, she saw a satisfaction in his amber eyes that made her stomach churn. The vampire Queen Lilith and Alpha Prime Fenris, he said, his voice dripping with malicious glee. The greatest love story in supernatural history, and the greatest tragedy. They fell in love during the Treaty of Shadows 3 decades ago, but when their union produced a hybrid child, both courts declared it an abomination. They had to choose, Kieran continued, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. Keep you and watch their kingdoms tear each other apart in a war that would have destroyed both species, or give you up and let you live in anonymity. They chose to save their people and sacrifice their own happiness. The pain in his voice told her that he understood the magnitude of their sacrifice in ways that only someone who'd lost everything could comprehend. But your existence was never forgotten by those who knew the truth. There are factions on both sides who would kill to get their hands on you, and others who would die to protect you. The research facility, she breathed, remembering the theft Kieran had mentioned back at the penthouse. Someone knows what I am, don't they? That's why they stole the werewolf serum. They want to use my blood to create an army of hybrids. The thought made her physically ill, but it also explained so much about the strange events of the past few days. Marcus's obsession hadn't just been about possessing her. He'd been trying to claim a prize beyond imagination. Kieran's immediate protection hadn't been random kindness. He'd recognized what she was, even if only subconsciously, and his alpha instincts had driven him to secure the most valuable supernatural being in existence. Your blood is the key to everything, Marcus said, his eyes burning with fanatical hunger as he stared at her transformed features. With the right ritual, the right combination of vampire and werewolf magic, you could create an entire new species. Beings with the strengths of both bloodlines and the weaknesses of neither. The supernatural world would bow before such power. His words painted a picture of horror that made her want to disappear entirely, but they also explained why she'd never felt like she truly belonged anywhere. She wasn't just caught between two worlds, she was the bridge between them, whether she wanted to be or not. That's why you really wanted me, she said, the pieces finally clicking into place as she looked between Marcus and Kieran. Not because you loved me, but because you knew what I was worth. Both of you. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and she saw guilt flash across Kieran's face even as Marcus's expression twisted with rage. I genuinely loved you, Kieran said quietly, but his words rang hollow in the face of such devastating revelations. I still do. But I won't lie and say I didn't recognize your value the moment I saw you. The Alpha King doesn't survive for centuries without learning to identify potential threats and assets. And I wanted to claim that power for myself, Marcus admitted with brutal honesty that was somehow more painful than comfortable lies would have been. The Blackwood line has always served as guardians against supernatural threats, but imagine what we could accomplish with a hybrid mate. I could have ruled both species through you. His amber eyes burned with frustrated ambition, and she realized that his obsession had never been about her as a person, She'd been a trophy to be won, a weapon to be wielded, a key to unlock power beyond imagination. The silver light around her hands began to pulse more rapidly, responding to her emotional turmoil with increasing intensity. She could feel both aspects of her nature warring within her, the wolf that wanted to run and hide, and the vampire that wanted to feast and conquer. The city around them seemed to hold its breath as supernatural energy crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice breaking as the weight of her true heritage settled on her shoulders like a mountain. "How am I supposed to live knowing that my very existence could start a war?" "You're supposed to choose," said a new voice, and all three of them spun around to see a figure emerging from the shadows between two abandoned buildings. The woman was tall and elegant, with silver hair that seemed to glow in the streetlights and eyes that held the weight of centuries. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, and the air around her shimmered with barely contained power. "Hello, daughter," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical accent of old-world royalty. "I've been searching for you for 30 years. Seraphina's world tilted sideways as she stared at the woman who could only be Queen Lilith, her mother, the legendary vampire monarch whose love affair had nearly destroyed 2 kingdoms. Behind her, another figure stepped into the light, a massive man with silver hair and golden eyes that marked him as Alpha royalty. Her father. Alpha Prime Fenris, the Wolf King whose pack controlled most of Northern Europe. They'd found her at last, just as her true nature was finally awakening, and the look in their eyes told her that the real danger was only just beginning. The time for hiding was over, and the supernatural world was about to discover that the lost hybrid princess had finally come home. Chapter 5, The Final Confrontation. Marcus emerged from the shadows like a specter of her worst nightmares, his once handsome face twisted by months of obsession and rage. He'd lost weight since she'd last seen him, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and his amber eyes sunken deep in their sockets. But his physical deterioration only made him more dangerous. He moved with the jerky, unpredictable energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever, Sarah?" he called out, his voice echoing off the abandoned storefronts that lined the blood-soaked street. "Did you think this monster could protect you from what you owe me?" His gaze flicked to Kieran with barely contained hatred, and she could see the moment he registered the true extent of her mate's power. Fear flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly burned away by the flames of his madness. "She owes you nothing," Kieran replied, his voice deadly calm as he stepped protectively in front of Seraphina. Even in human form, he radiated an aura of controlled violence that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. "Your mate bond was rejected. She's free to choose her own path, and she's chosen me." The simple statement hit Marcus like a physical blow, and his face contorted with fury. "Chosen you?" he spat, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She's a broken little thing who can't even defend herself. What could the great Alpha King possibly want with damaged goods?" The insult hung in the air like poison, and Seraphina felt something inside her chest crack open. All her fears and insecurities, every cruel word he'd ever whispered in her ear, came flooding back in a rush of self-doubt. But before she could spiral into the familiar darkness of worthlessness, Kieran's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both gentle and unbreakably strong. "She's the strongest wolf I've ever met," he said firmly, his golden eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "She survived your abuse, escaped when staying would have destroyed her, and built a new life from nothing. She saved wounded animals when she could barely feed herself, and she chose kindness over bitterness even when the world showed her nothing but cruelty. If that's not strength, then the word has no meaning." His words wrapped around her like armor, filling the hollow places in her heart with warmth and light. For the first time in her adult life, someone saw her clearly and found her worthy exactly as she was. Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. With a roar of rage, he shifted into his wolf form, a large brown creature with yellowed fangs and eyes that burned with insanity. He launched himself at Seraphina, claws extended in murder in his heart, but he never made it past Kieran's protective stance. The Alpha King moved with fluid grace, catching Marcus mid-leap and slamming him to the pavement with bone-crushing force. The impact left a spider web of cracks in the asphalt, and Marcus's wolf form convulsed as he struggled to breathe through what were probably several broken ribs. "You chose this," Kieran said conversationally, crouching down beside the fallen wolf. "You could have accepted her rejection and moved on with your life. Instead, you hunted her, terrorized her, and brought mercenaries into my city. Those choices have consequences." What happened next was swift and final. Kieran's claws extended just enough to find the precise pressure point at the base of Marcus's skull, and her ex-mate's struggles ceased instantly. He wasn't dead, but he would never wake up, trapped forever in a coma that would give him an eternity to dream about the choices that had led him to this moment. "It's over," Kieran said softly, rising to his feet and pulling Seraphina into his arms. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in his comforting scent as the last of her nightmares finally faded away. Around them, the city slowly began to return to normal, police barriers going up, EMTs treating the wounded, cleanup crews arriving to repair the damage. But for Seraphina, the real healing was just beginning. In Kieran's arms, surrounded by his strength and love, she finally felt safe enough to believe in forever. 6 months later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of their new penthouse, watching the sun set over the city that had become her home. The wedding ring on her finger caught the dying light, sending rainbow sparkles across the marble railing, a physical reminder of the ceremony that had bound her to Kieran not just as his mate, but as his queen. The supernatural world had initially questioned his choice of bride, but her gentle strength and natural healing abilities had quickly won over even the most skeptical pack leaders. She'd found her place at his side, using her gifts to mediate disputes and tend to wolves who needed her care. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely at peace. "Penny for your thoughts," Kieran murmured, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. His scent still made her heart race, even after months of marriage, and she leaned into his embrace with a contented sigh. "Just thinking about how different everything is now," she admitted, covering his hands with hers. "6 months ago, I was sleeping in abandoned buildings and wondering if I'd ever feel safe again. Now I'm married to the Alpha King and helping to run the supernatural world. It feels like a fairy tale." His lips found the sensitive spot behind her ear, and she shivered as he placed a gentle kiss there. "The best fairy tales always start with the princess being rescued by her true love," he said softly. "Though in our case, I think we rescued each other." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp buzz of Kieran's emergency phone, the secure line reserved for threats to supernatural security. His expression grew serious as he read the encrypted message, and Seraphina felt a familiar chill of apprehension run down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. They'd had 6 months of happiness, 6 months of building their life together without constant danger lurking in the shadows. She'd been foolish to think it would last forever. "There's been an incident at the research facility in Colorado," he said grimly, his golden eyes taking on the hard edge that meant he was switching into Alpha King mode. 3 of our scientists are dead, and their entire project has been stolen." "What kind of project?" she pressed, though something in his expression told her she wasn't going to like the answer. Kieran hesitated for a moment, and she could see him weighing how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed and met her eyes directly. "They were working on a serum that could strip supernatural abilities from wolves," he admitted. "It was meant to be a humane alternative to execution for criminals who couldn't be rehabilitated. But in the wrong hands." He didn't need to finish the sentence. "A weapon that could permanently destroy a wolf's connection to their other half would be worth billions to the right buyer, and there were plenty of humans who would pay any price to level the playing field between the species. The thieves left a message," Kieran continued, his voice taking on the deadly calm that meant he was planning violence. "They want to arrange a meeting, with you specifically." Seraphina's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. "Me? But why would they?" She stopped as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. Her healing abilities, her unusual strength for someone who'd never trained as a warrior, the strange dreams that had become more frequent since their mating. She'd been trying to ignore the signs, but they were becoming harder to dismiss. "You know why," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You've known all along, haven't you?" Kieran's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with secrets that could reshape everything they'd built together. "Because you're not just a healer, my love. You're something much rarer, much more powerful. And now, someone else has figured out what you really are." For the first time, Seraphina felt safe in Damon's arms, but in the shadows of the city, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate.